Yesterday, images of a lone airplane floating in a frosty New York City river captivated the country. Pictures of stranded passengers standing on sinking wings beamed around the world. It was a day of survival tales and stories of rescue that were amazing and inspiring. The thing that was supposed to be the big news of the day was President Bush's primetime farewell address, where he talked again about the tough decisions he's made. Oh, and he again conflated his war on terror with the war in Iraq. But coverage of the still president's speech was relegated to page A21 in today's New York Times. Occupying the above-the-fold territory on the front page instead was this take-your-breath-away image of American survival and resilience. Yesterday's was the story of miraculous skill and survival. Today, we started to realize the things that made that survival possible. This morning, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg honored some of the heroes of the emergency landing, the first responders, official and not, who were on the scene almost immediately, the ferry boat crews, the commuters, the tugboat captains, whose natural inclination was to rush toward the sinking plane and to start rescuing people.
As I turned the boat around and started to pull out into the main channel, I looked up and I said to my deckhand, that's an odd-looking boat. He goes, I think that's an airplane. I said, okay. So get the man overboard equipment ready. We radioed the Coast Guard on VHF 16, and we got to it. Did what we do best.
The mayor wanted to give the plane's pilot, Chesley Sully Sullenberger, the key to New York City. But pilot Sully remains out of public view. He will be interviewed by NTSB officials tomorrow. That's the National Transportation Safety Board. Today, his wife spoke to reporters outside their home in Northern California.
We are very grateful that everyone is off the airplane safely. And that was really what my husband asked to convey to everyone. And, of course, we are very proud of Dad and very shocked. He's a pilot's pilot, and he loves the art of the airplane.
Starting, of course, with Captain Sullenberger himself, so much did go right yesterday. I mean, honestly, this particular captain was basically the ideal person you would have constructed to handle this situation. He's a former Air Force fighter pilot. In addition to flying commercial planes, he just happens to run an aviation safety consulting business. Remarkably, he has been studying the psychology of keeping airline crews functioning in the face of crisis. And if that weren't enough, he's also a certified glider pilot, which is pretty handy for someone who is forced to pilot a plane that has two inoperable engines on fire. And while all of that makes this all that more remarkable as a story, it is also part of the reason that this remarkable story has a larger point. This captain was very well trained, well prepared for the crisis he faced. There's no doubt he acted courageously and heroically and with incredible skill, but he was able to do what he did because of the training that he had. The same is true for the flight attendants on board, and also for the first responders, especially the official first responders, firefighters, Coast Guard, police divers. They were on scene minutes after the crash. They were able to quickly pluck 35 passengers out of the icy waters in circumstances in which just 5 minutes in this water, 36-degree water, would have caused hypothermia. The ferries and the boats that happened to be in the right place at the right time, well, because of good regulations, good training, good enforcement, they were well equipped with life vests and ropes and the man overboard equipment to pull in the survivors. Even the plane itself was built well enough so it could withstand a reported 140-mile-an-hour crash landing onto the water without breaking up. It is good fortune and individual skill and heroism and pluck that explains yesterday's happy ending, but it is also testament to us having some good systems and some good institutions in place to mitigate damage, to maximize people's options in worst-case scenarios, to ensure that people who could encounter worst-case scenarios are trained to deal with them, to respond quickly, to avoid panic. These systems, professional accreditation, regulations, code enforcement, disaster preparedness, training, equipment, you know what this stuff is? This is the backbone of our national resilience. Our ability to handle the unexpected, to be ready for worst-case scenarios, to be able to react with speed and intelligence, to be able to react effectively when disaster strikes. This type of resilience does not happen on its own. It is the product of us investing in being resilient as a nation and as communities. And that kind of investment is often overlooked. It's taken for granted until something like this incredibly dramatic story happened like it did yesterday, until an airplane blows out 2 engines over the Bronx somewhere and winds up gliding just barely over the George Washington Bridge and coming down safely into a New York City river. So, as all of the inevitable and necessary what went wrong investigations get underway now, it may also be smart and useful to look at what went right yesterday, what we can learn from what happened, how we can use those lessons to become a more resilient country. Joining us now is a man who wrote a book I would put first on the list if we ever did a Rachel Maddow Show book club. His book is called The Edge of Disaster, Rebuilding a Resilient Nation. Our guest is the author Stephen Flynn, a retired Coast Guard officer and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Flynn, thank you so much for making time to come on the show tonight.
Rachel, it's great to be with you.
New York Governor David Paterson called this the miracle on the Hudson. And of course it was miraculous. But when I was sort of studying this in order to cover it last night, as I continue to work on the story today, I wondered if you were seeing things behind the scenes here, systems that were designed to make a crash like this work out as well as possible.
Rachel, you're absolutely right that it's the behind-the-scenes stuff that really is something we should be admiring in the day after. You know, the notion it's a miracle seems like it's like winning the lottery. But the fact is there were several things that had to happen for this to work right. There's no question it was a lot of good fortune. But first, as you pointed out at the top, there was training. There was a very well-trained pilot and crew. Secondly, people, when giving information in good directions, respond well. I mean, I think a lot of pundits and a lot of our leaders are probably in shock, they think, because people panic, they suppose. That's not actually the reality. If you give people information and direction, they behave very well. Third thing is, while, of course, the first responders did a superb job, the very first responder was a ferry boat, was a captain basically seeing something going wrong and the first to respond and help, and that's exactly the way things often work. It's the first responders, not necessarily the professionals, they're you and I. The passengers aboard helping each other, the ferries who happen to be on scene and got there first and helped along the way. And all of this basically suggests how important it is that we think about being prepared as a society and investing in the kinds of things that we must have when things go wrong, because they do go wrong from time to time. What a contrast this was, wasn't it, between the president last night giving a speech, taking credit for 7 years of keeping us safe from another act of terror. There's no question that that's a good thing. But all the things that we saw on display in New York Harbor yesterday were not things that we've been investing at the federal level. We haven't been spending a lot of time building the local capability. We haven't spent a lot of time informing citizens of what to do when things go wrong. We haven't done the kinds of training, in some cases regulation, we need to make sure that things that are really critical in our society bend but don't break when things go wrong from time to time.
One of the initiatives of the Bush administration post 9/11 was Ready.gov, this idea that there would be an investment in citizen readiness in the case of either natural disaster or, of course, in the case of a terrorist attack, God forbid. How do you rate, I guess, the impulse behind Ready.gov, but also the effectiveness? What else could be done toward that end?
Well, the Ready.gov is a good site to go to get information. The problem is not many people are going there. And that's because, frankly, of the absence of leadership. You know, what we've heard for the last 7 years is that essentially the federal government is going to take care of us, that they're going to do things far away and we can go about our lives like going to the mall here. The fact is we need information, and some of that information is available. But let me just put one number in effect. There is $15 million being spent this year, as was last year and the year before, on something called Citizen Corps, a program to help mobilize us as a nation to be prepared for just these kinds of things. $15 million represents about what we've been spending every hour on the hour for 24 hours, 7 days a week, for 5 years in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. In other words, 1 hour of investment for citizen preparedness for all the investments we've made in the conventional wars overseas. That's a crazy formula. The fact is we can't prevent every act of terror, and we're certainly not going to prevent the accidents in all instances from happening. You know, that's the other important thing the aviation industry teaches us. As good as they are, and they are darn good, they assume from time to time things will go wrong, and they compel their pilots and provide the support for them and their flight crew to train. And they spend time talking to us. I'm afraid many times we ignore them, and that's really something I hope passengers take away from this here is pay attention to those flight attendants. Look at those boarding cards, because information can really help when you need it, and it's hard to get by when you're in the middle of a crisis.
And think about the importance of the fact that we get drilled on that stuff, and even if we are trying to ignore the flight attendants when they are telling us, we do get drilled on it, and it's an important lesson in taking safety seriously and preparedness seriously. Stephen Flynn, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, author of Edge of Disaster, Rebuilding a Resilient Nation. Thanks for your time tonight, sir.
Thanks so much for having me.